This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, now we're on. Okay, so my name's Abby Schumacher. I'm a school educator with Seed St. Louis. And I'm just going to start by giving you an introduction to who we are as an organization. I'm not sure where everyone is coming from tonight. I recognized some names, so I know that we have some local folks here, but often when we do webinars, we have people coming from all over. So I'm not going to assume you're from St. Louis and know who we are. So our mission is to empower people and communities to grow food. We used to be called Gateway Greening, so you may know us under that name, but we changed our name a couple of years ago to Seed St. Louis because there's so many gateway things. It was getting confusing. And our vision is equitable access to fresh, healthy food throughout our region. We know that there is not equitable access to food, so we do our part in helping to build that through a garden network. So we provide education, we provide resources, and of course a network, a community of people to grow their own food. As this relates to our school program, we start this process of empowerment and community building, positive associations with the outdoors and with healthy food. We start that at a young age through our school program, and also in the process give children access to healthy food. So this is a map of our network of gardens. We have orchards, we have school gardens, we have community gardens, and approximately 250 projects throughout the St. Louis region and the Metro East part of Illinois. So we're in North City, South City, all parts of the county. So we're kind of all over, and this map is available on our website if you're interested in things near you, if you're local, or if you're just curious about the areas that we serve. This also includes 18 land trust projects. So these are gardens that had previously leased land from the city that we sort of put into this land trust to keep them preserved, to keep them as gardens forever. So that's a good thing. And then when you are in our network, what we offer you is free and discounted seeds and seedlings. So, and right now I'm speaking specifically to what we offer schools in our network. You get free and discounted seeds and seedlings, access to volunteer groups. We have a tool loan program. We offer classes and workshops, just like the one that you're taking now. We do these virtually. We're also doing them in person now. So we have sort of a hybrid model going on. We have networking opportunities, and we'll have more of those this year where you can meet other school gardeners and have some chances to get together and share some of your ideas and resources. We have a curriculum that's available to you online. It's called Seed to STEM, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. We'll touch on that a little later. And we also offer further curriculum resources beyond that, since that's just like 5 units in the content area of STEM, but we offer other curriculum support as well. And then, by the way, you will get a copy of this presentation, and the links in it should be live. So don't worry about all the links right now. I will make sure you get them emailed out to you. So the School Garden Support Services link here, you can go to our website and you can request an educator to visit your school, Tanya or myself, to come demonstrate a garden-based lesson on site. You can request us for professional development at your school, and you can also just request consultations if you want to sit down and have a meeting about specific issues or questions. So those are the benefits of being in our network of school gardens. Okay, so getting to tonight, I will talk for a while, but then I'll save a few minutes at the end just to go through questions and whatnot. So don't worry about that. We'll have a little bit of time at the end. And again, feel free to put things in the Q&A now or the chat if you have resources to share with others. So our goals for this evening, we're going to cover the who, what, when, and how of school garden design. Kind of sounds like a lot. Hopefully I've boiled it down for you and organized it in such a way that it's digestible. And we're going to start with who, but we're really going to focus on what to do, what to include, what to build, what to plant. It's just that who is part of your garden community is going to inform all of those choices. So looking at who is really important, who's the garden for, who makes up your school garden community, what should you plant, build, include, consider. A lot of this is going to be considerations for you, ideas, because I don't know your individual school garden. So a lot of these decisions are going to be up to you, and I will just give you things to think about. When can you use the school garden? So one of the main questions that we get about school gardens is, well, kids are out of school in May. They don't come back till the end of August. That's when the garden is like the most prolific and bountiful. So how can we actually make this work? I'll give you some tips on how to maximize your time with a school garden. And then the how, right? How to implement this design, how to make the most of the assets in your community, how to make the most of your resources, and also your physical space. So the goal here being to create a safe and inclusive outdoor learning environment. And I would say that comes before building a functional or productive garden, which I think surprises some people, but safe and inclusive is really the only environment in which kids learn. So we have to make sure that our garden is functioning that way. And if you don't have the most beautiful, bountiful garden with food that's feeding the entire school at every lunch, that's totally okay. Most school gardens don't operate like that anyway and don't have those kinds of resources, but you can still have a really healthy learning environment without having the most amazing garden. And I'll touch more on that later too. So what this isn't, which may surprise you a little bit, is a gardening 101 class. So I'm not necessarily giving you the basics of gardening, because we're going to focus on the learning and the teaching that can happen in a garden, but not necessarily all of the labor. So not pounds of produce, but the quality of your instruction and the quality of your environment and space, and how to make that work for your specific community. Okay, so before we get into the who, what, when, and how, I just wanted to say that you should expect a school garden space to be different, maybe than what you're used to. Some of you may have been doing this a long time, maybe some of you are just getting started, but it's different than an indoor classroom, and it's different than a backyard garden too. You have to have sort of a different set of expectations. So first of all, you can't expect quiet and still. When children go outside, they feel, I think, a little bit more free. They're used to being at recess when they're outside. So don't necessarily expect quiet and still, but there are still ways that we can establish this as a learning space and not necessarily resource time. Recess time. So you want to preserve that room to play and to explore, to be curious, to ask questions, to get a little bit messy, to make some mistakes, to get distracted. Like, these are all the kinds of things that are going to happen in a school garden environment. So a few tips in terms of like existing in this space and still having a learning environment. Set a few expectations, make promises to one another about how we behave in the garden and what our boundaries are, you know, whether or not we should put things in our mouths, or how we use tools correctly, how to be safe with water, and make sure we take breaks in the shade, all those kinds of things. So set some of those expectations in terms of safety, and then also just how to be outside together. Review those daily, have routines or little rituals that you do with your students, and vary the activities and the tasks. I think one really helpful thing to do in a school garden space is have stations. And I actually listened to a little presentation today where they were talking about having a station for the garden. So you're watering or you're fertilizing or you're helping the garden in some way. You have a station where you're taking from the garden, so you're harvesting maybe. You have a station that's exploratory where children can just observe. And then you have sort of a quiet and reflective station too. So those are just a few ideas, but it sort of gives kids some agency in the space, and you can kind of mix it up and hold their attention for a little bit longer since you're outside. Okay, and if you're totally starting from scratch with designing a school garden, like your space looks like one of these photos, like you just have a lawn or it's just a side lot. Some things that you are going to want to consider before building this garden space: the location, right? How visible is it to the community? Because that can be a really good thing. What kind of noise is it exposed to from the street or from other kinds of work nearby or from traffic? How close is it to the school building? Do children have to walk very far? Do they have access to a bathroom? Do they need a field trip form to go? All of those things. So think about the location, of course, your water source. That's a struggle for a lot of gardens, specifically in urban environments, to make sure that they have an adequate water source that's close to the garden. Do some soil testing, especially if you plan on doing any planting in the ground. I would recommend raised beds really wherever you are. Tends to work better with kids anyway, because then they're not stepping in things and you can make them different sizes, etc. But test your soil, test it for heavy metals if you're going to be digging straight in the ground at any point. Also, of course, you want to know where any utilities are. That's really important. Get some administrative support and build a garden committee. So what we recommend to schools is that you have at least one administrator, one teacher, and one parent that are fully on board to lead your garden committee. This is really helpful for schools so that it doesn't all fall on a volunteer parent or a teacher by themselves. Administrative support is really crucial. You'll need maintenance plans. You'll want to know how you're going to take care of it and who's in charge, week by week or class by class, however you want to do it. Of course, think about your budget, and I'll have some tips for you on how to design your garden in a way that's more budget friendly, because I know schools are working with a lot of limited resources. And of course, have a plan for your harvest. What's going to happen with all this food? Do the kids get to take it home? Do they eat it at school? Do families get to share it? Does it go home with teachers? So all things to think about if you're really starting to build a school garden from scratch. Now, many of you may already have school garden spaces and it's almost springtime and you're like, okay, how do we do this? How do we make the most of this space? So the first thing that I would suggest is thinking about your community a little bit. Again, who's the garden for? Who are your students? Who are your teachers? Who makes up your community? And I think the reason that this is important, well, there's a few different reasons that I think this is important. One is that your garden can be culturally relevant, that it makes sense among your own community. So the first thing that I would say about that is check your assumptions about school gardening. I don't think that we can always assume that students and teachers will be excited about being in a garden space. You can't assume interest or knowledge of gardening or family history and associations with food and gardening, comfort level in the garden. You can't really assume any of those things. So you might be really excited about your school garden, but not everybody is necessarily going to be on board. And that's totally okay because we're all different people. So don't make any assumptions, but try to focus on spaces that bring joy, that ignite interest among your students and the youth that you're working with. And one way to do that is to give them agency and voice in this process of planning. So that can look like exploring seed catalogs together, asking them what they eat at home, what their favorite foods are, what their grandma makes for special occasions, and really sharing some stories and histories and getting a sense of what it is that your kids really eat and might want to learn how to grow, and involving them in that whole process. You need to know what kind of developmental and physical abilities you have among your students, your teachers, your community, anyone that's going to be in the garden. And this is a lot of things, right? It's ages, for one. There's some special considerations for very little kids, you know, which I will talk about in a second. Kids have allergies. They have different physical needs. They have different learning styles. They're in different places with things. And knowing this is, in terms of design, is going to influence, you know, the size, the location, the type of plants and structures and tools that you have in your garden. And I will say more about all of that. Children have different sensory capacities. People really like building sensory gardens, you know, where you can see a lot of color, or there's lots of different smells or lots of different textures. That could be really overwhelming for some students. So those things are great to have in the garden, but maybe think about integrating them in a lot of spaces rather than putting them all in one space. So just kind of taking into consideration what it is, who your students are, and what it is that they need, what kinds of boundaries, what kinds of freedom, what kinds of tasks. And all of that is going to inform what you're choosing when it comes to your hardscape elements and your plants as well. And of course, you know, what's the space being used for? Is it being used for events? What kind of things do you want to teach in the garden? And what kind of strengths does your community have that they can contribute? Maybe you have like a great carpenter who's a parent in your school community, and you want to take advantage of that strength and, you know, have a bunch of things that grow on trellises. So just some ideas for considering your community, because it influences a lot of things related to design in a school garden. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what you would want to have in your in terms of hardscape elements. So like the structures in your garden, how to build things in your garden, what sorts of elements to include. So not necessarily plants, but like all the other stuff. And without knowing your specific school community, I just kind of divided this up into 4 areas. So thinking about safety and accessibility, thinking about your environment, where you are, your budget, some tips on how to, you know, make the most of limited funds, and then also what you want to be teaching. So in terms of safety, think about the paths in your garden. What sorts of material do they need to be made out of so that they can be like easily traversed? Sometimes it's good to have both wide open paths so groups can walk through, and sometimes it's good to have narrower paths so that we can slow down a little bit and take time to observe. So maybe integrating a few different things in terms of your pathways. The height and size of your beds and trellises, and plants too, which we'll get to in a second. But you know, how big, how tall should things be? This has a lot to do with age. How big are your kids? And maybe you're doing like K through 8. So you're going to have all different sizes of children. So put some beds that are maybe like lower to the ground, and then maybe have some beds that are a little bit higher, or even, you know, for preschoolers, little beds on legs that they can stand up and work in the garden. That works really well for that age group. So think about how high and how big things are, and whether it's accessible to your students. Kinds of tools that you have. Soil and fertilizer is not really hardscape elements, but you definitely want to kind of know what you're dealing with in the dirt, which I think I mentioned a little earlier. Is there access to a bathroom? Is there access to shade? Is there access to drinking water? So good things to keep in mind for outdoor classroom spaces. And also having some boundaries and some openness as well. Both of those are good to have in your garden space. Placemaking features. So what this means in terms of your environment, and it can actually mean a lot of different things. It can be like signs that are in multiple languages that reflect the languages at your school, entrance markers, memorable structures, things that highlight your local environment, the landscape, an important person, art that reflects the community. So things that make them see themselves and see their community reflected in this space, and make them feel welcome and at home. So you want to think about, again, your water sources, where your sunlight is in your garden space, and structure things accordingly so that everything's getting what it needs and that everyone is comfortable working in the garden too. And how much or how little space do you have? Another consideration, specifically in terms of how you're going to be planting some things, which I'll say more about. You can use recycled materials. You don't have to buy all new lumber to build everything. You can use, use things with caution. You don't necessarily want to use like some really old painted pot that has like lead paint on it or something. So like just make sure that you know kind of what the material maybe was treated with or where it came from. But you can recycle all sorts of things. You can use things like tires. I wouldn't use them for edible materials, but you can plant flowers in old tires. So there's lots of different things you can use, but exercise caution and decide whether or not you can plant edibles in those spaces. Things can be versatile. So I will show you, maybe I have this book, which you may or may not be able to see because I know my little picture is really tiny, but it's called The Children's Garden, Growing Food in the City. And there's a picture of some children in this book where they're taking a nap under a big bean tent. So you could build a large trellis of beans, and that could also serve as shade in your garden. So some things can function as more than one thing. And it's usually good if you can make that happen. And then just using natural materials, hay bales for sitting on, stones for making pathways, tree stumps for seeding as well. And a lot of these things are just available around the city, especially tree stumps. You can get those pretty easily. And then for teaching in the garden, in terms of your hardscape considerations, you want to make sure that there's seating, that there's somewhere to write and to reflect, that there's maybe some individual space and also some communal space. And then something like, I put compost bins in there because that's a good structural thing to have in terms of teaching about like soil and decomposition, for example. Just one example of a structural element that can really be a tool for you in terms of your curriculum and your lesson planning. So here's just some examples. In the middle here, this is a mural that's at Academy Sherman Park Community Garden here in St. Louis on the north side. It says "Hope Grows Here," and the houses behind it reflect what the local community looks like. So that's just a good example of an element that sort of understands like where this garden is located, who it's home to. So I thought that was a pretty picture. There's seating here, old tree stumps that children have decorated. You can decorate them, you don't have to. Here's some kids sitting in circle. They also have some tables behind them. Different sizes of raised beds. And also this picture down here, I don't know if you can see the arrow with my mouse, but it's the garden beds, the raised garden beds with tall fences next to them and also a big tree. This is sort of an interesting space for a garden because you have very set boundaries. You have some shade from the tree. You have some sunlight and some openness. So it doesn't have to be like this elaborate setup. Like you can include multiple elements and still make it very simple as well. Okay, so plant considerations for a school garden. A lot of this has to do with, well, in terms of safety and accessibility, I would say this has a lot to do with the ages of children. At least that's primarily what I was thinking about. Obviously, there's a lot of other things to take into consideration, but of course, you want to avoid inedible or harmful plants. So think, anything poisonous, anything with thorns. Like if you want to do raspberries, you can find varieties that don't have thorns, and that'll make it easier on the kids. So yeah, hopefully there's nothing harmful in your garden. Spicy peppers, that's another one. Maybe avoid that depending on, some of your kids might be really familiar with spicy food and love spicy food and they really want to grow that, but just different things to exercise caution on. Growing plants with multiple edible parts is actually really great. So things like broccoli, where you can eat the stems. The actual broccoli is technically the flower, and even after it opens and you see those little yellow flowers, those are edible too. So you can sort of get more out of those plants that have multiple edible parts. Carrots, you can eat carrot tops and make all kinds of fun things with carrot tops, in addition to the carrots themselves, of course. Growing snacks that don't need any preparation. So things that if kids want to taste test in the garden, like this picture here, this is my son just grabbing a lunchbox pepper out of the garden. Have lots of things like tiny little peppers or peas or green beans or lettuces or cherry tomatoes that are easy to just pick and eat without needing knives or cooking or any other kind of preparation. And then, like I said earlier, spread out your sensory plants. So maybe don't put all the plants that have really strong smells or textures like all in one place. Maybe spread those throughout your garden so it's not overwhelming, and so that there can be some exploring that happens throughout your school garden. So also consider in terms of the environment that your plants are growing in. I will talk about planting dates in a second. I know that's always like a concern for folks, like how soon can we put things in, how late can they stay, etc. So you'll want to be considering your planting dates. If you use native and perennial things, sometimes that's a little bit easier. Natives are a little bit tricky to get established, but if you have them, of course, they'll probably do well in their environment because they belong here. And then things that come back every year can make things easier. Like if you have an herb garden, maybe you want to grow sage and oregano because those will come back the following year and you don't have to keep replanting. That's good for your budget too. It can be lower maintenance to have perennial things. Foods that you can preserve that can be eaten in different stages. I always think of green beans here because they can be eaten when they're young and green, when they plump up a little bit, but before they dry, they can be cooked sort of like a dry bean and sauteed. And then you can also let them dry and harvest them that way. So things that you can eat at different times, the same crop that can be harvested at different times or preserved in certain ways. Plants that give you a little bit more bang for your buck in a school garden. Think of greens, root veggies. You can do a lot in a small space. Again, green beans, cucumbers, think of things that maybe are on vines or things that you would like pick a lot of, because sometimes picking things can actually, like if you're picking green beans and peas, then more of them will get produced, right? Because you're taking like the energy, all that energy that the plant already put into a piece of fruit, you're removing that, and they can spend more energy on creating more fruit, right? So these are plants that can give you more bang for your buck, as opposed to like, melons or brassicas. So like cauliflower and broccoli, sometimes those things just take up a large space and take a lot of time. They're more slower growing. Something like corn, which can be, good for more like for larger areas. Still good things that you can try out in your garden, of course. But if you're looking for getting a little bit more for a little bit less work, maybe avoid those. And then, of course, things that are a little bit more resilient to digging and picking and watering. Green beans and peas are good examples of that. Cut and come again leaf lettuces rather than head lettuces, because when you pick off a leaf, those lettuces will grow back. And then in terms of what you're teaching in the garden, things to consider for plants, things that have, I like the idea of saving like a lot of materials from the garden, examining a lot of different kinds of root systems or leaves or flowers or seeds. So observing these types of things outside, but then also being able to bring some of them inside and save them for indoor use, especially in the winter time. So try to think of plants that have diverse plants that have sort of all of these components for studying. Think of pollinator plants. There's a lot that you can do in your curriculum in terms of studying pollinators and also companion planting. Maybe when you're talking about pests, or there's even like history applications. They're one of the most like famous companion planting trios is called the Three Sisters, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. So that's growing corn, beans, and squash together. For both nutritional value, and then also, corn is a heavy nitrogen feeder and the beans provide that. And then the squash provides sort of this like weed cover at the base. So lots of interesting things to study in terms of companion planting. And then I'd really like to give you a lot of examples of theme gardens, which I'll get to in just a moment here. Okay, I think that I've been looking into theme gardens a lot for school spaces. I think they're really interesting. I think they're fun. I think they can sort of simplify your designs and give you some very clear direction in terms of what you want in your garden. So there's all sorts of ideas about theme gardens. I don't have time right now to sort of run through all of the plants and structures and things you would include for each of these, but they're very easy to research. So if you want a garden specifically for teaching STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, math types of content, right? You can have a bird garden, right? Create spaces for birds to have water, shelter, and food, right? Think of like the things that birds eat, the spaces where they're gonna nest. And then this also creates a really wonderful winter observation environment. Butterfly gardens, companion planting and native planting and pollinator planting, like I've already mentioned. Rain gardens, where you can study weather and water systems and local geography, the local environment. I think seed saving gardens are really great and have applications beyond STEM, but I have all these pictures here of seeds at, harvest time. And seeds are just, I think, really fascinating to study in terms of how they work, right? All these different, if you're studying adaptations, like all this floss here on the milkweed seed, right? That enables the seed to like fly away and spread itself around. So all seeds are different and have different qualities, different things that they need. So seeds are really fun to explore and to save. And then you can do like a tops and bottoms garden as well, for studying like plant parts that we eat. This is also the name of a children's book that's about, I think, a bear and a rabbit that plant a garden together. So if you want to move beyond STEM, you're not a science teacher, or you're focused on some other content area, there's so much that you can do in a garden, so much garden-based learning that you can do moving beyond STEM. It doesn't just have to be science in the garden. It can also be art and music in the garden. You can have a rainbow garden and explore all different colors. Like sometimes kids don't know that radishes come in like 5 different colors, or carrots come in infinite colors, as do tomatoes and lots of other things. So you can create rainbow gardens. You can create a cloth and dye garden. Plant plants that are used to make dyes. Again, a bird garden, you can build bird feeders. A pollinator garden, you can build bug houses. So those are great theme ideas if you want a garden that you can use for like art and music. So social studies, there's so much history that can go into plants, local plants, just where plants come from, our food system, so many applications here. You can have a garden that represents the different, maybe the different immigrant populations at your school, and the students can take some agency over planting what goes in each of those beds. You can study a particular historical figure, say like George Washington Carver. You can be studying peanuts and sweet potatoes, and plant those things in your history garden. Lots of applications in terms of, lots of theme garden ideas in terms of social emotional learning, physical education, nutrition, herb and medicinal gardens. Peace gardens can be really fun. There was this one idea that I came across of there were 3 sisters in Burlington, Vermont that entered this contest for building a peace and healing garden. And some of their design elements included, it was shaped like a yin yang symbol in their peace garden. They had caring carrots and a sunflower sanctuary. They had companion plants, which you can talk about like how we protect each other, right? So this idea of a peace and healing garden, and sort of like letting their imaginations go with what that could look like. Of course, sensory gardens, pizza gardens, salad gardens. You can do all kinds of themes that could help you talk about nutrition. And then for English and language arts, right, an alphabet garden. So learning letters, right, for little ones, and planting plants kind of by the alphabet, a storybook. And you can also like do scavenger hunts, like what starts with the letter C, look for cucumbers. A storybook garden where you can plant plants that sort of match the books that you're reading, again, works really well for younger students. Okay, so I'm going to pause in a couple of minutes to take some questions. I'm almost at the end here, so I'll probably just run through, and then and then we can talk about some questions in a couple of minutes. So when can you plant? When can you make use of the school garden? I would recommend cool season plants, right? Spring and fall planting. And then also you can consider overwintering crops. So this is a link to a list of recommended overwintering varieties for the St. Louis area that we provide on our website. Again, you'll you'll receive this presentation via email, and you'll be able to access all of these links. So this is just some examples of broccoli and cauliflower that usually, if they're covered when it's like really cold, you would be planting them in the fall and then see growth in the spring. They would overwinter in your garden. This is our planting calendar. This is also available to you online. Again, it's specific to the St. Louis area. If you're outside of St. Louis, you can contact your local extension office or botanical garden, and typically you'll be able to access a planting calendar. So this would tell you when to direct sow or when to put a transplant in. So there's a key at the bottom, and you can kind of study this and identify, for a school, like what can I do? What can I start in March? What can I be harvesting in May? And the same for the fall as well. And there are definitely some options. If you study this calendar, there are definitely some cool season options where you can sort of focus on spring and fall, making the best of those seasons, since that's when you have students. You can create some season extension infrastructure, so you can extend your season a little longer and do a little bit more outside during the winter. These are just some examples of that. There's lots of winter possibilities for learning outdoors. Like I said, you can learn about soil and decomposition. There's a little girl here studying her decomposing pumpkins. You can leave wild spaces in your garden for birds and for bugs. So, all different kinds of like brush piles or upside down pots make like great spaces for bugs to overwinter. Leave your leaves, that sort of thing. So maintain some wild spaces in your gardens. You can take care of the animal life that's still present over winter. Birds are a fun thing to observe in the wintertime. Many of those still stick around. You can also plant cover crops over the winter. If you're interested in that, we have recommended varieties of cover crops as well. And then, of course, there's indoor garden-based learning for those days when it's just too cold and there's just not a lot going on. Seed starting, that takes up a lot of time and energy and has wonderful curriculum applications. You can definitely start seeds with your students indoors. You can compost with worms indoors. You can save all those materials I was talking about earlier, certain kinds of leaves or seeds for studying inside, particularly if you want to study adaptations, for example, in your STEM unit. And then also, you can do all your planning, your research, your dreaming, your building interest and support. You can do a lot of that through the winter too. Lots of things to do to support your garden in the winter time. And then in summer, what does your garden look like in summer? It can totally look like this. You can put it to sleep for the summer. If you can't take care of it, if there's not really a strong garden committee happening, you can put it to sleep for the summer. You can cover it, you can leave it be, you can start back up again in the fall. That's definitely an option. You can also have families adopt beds, or teachers adopt beds and kind of week by week take on those responsibilities. So this is definitely what your garden can look like in the summer. If you have summer programming or volunteers, it can look bountiful and very different from this. In terms of implementing all of this, like how do you put it into the garden? How do you maximize the space? Companion plants are great for a lot of reasons, in terms of nutrients, in terms of pest control. It's great to look up what plants do well together, what plants protect other plants and feed other plants. There's lots of resources out there for learning more about that, and I'm happy to share that as well. Attract pollinators. The more pollinators you have, the more fruitful your garden is going to be. So make sure to plant some things that are going to attract all of our buzzing, busy friends. Square foot gardening is a wonderful resource. There's a book by Mel Bartholomew called Square Foot Gardening. And you can see in one of these photos how it's sort of like lined off. This is really a way of just like maximizing a small amount of space, planting things closer together. And, you know, on a seed packet, the directions will often be for row planting, where you have a lot of space, and square foot gardening switches up that math a little bit. So it allows you to kind of pack more in. I think it's personally a little bit tighter than maybe it should be, but for some things it works really well. And of course, taking advantage of vertical growing, so trellising and letting things climb. And then finally, what are the strengths in your community? I just put a copy here of what we use when gardens are developing. It's an asset map, so we think about partners in your community and mutually beneficial relationships that you can create. So either with, you know, maybe there's a local library or an Eagle Scouts group, or the PTO, the parent teacher organization, or a neighborhood association. Lots of different community partners that you could work with, offering fresh produce, offering event space, and then they can offer you knowledge, expertise, skills, funding, all kinds of things. So do that mapping in your community and figure out how you can make the best use of the people around you and their skills. Have regular meetings, make a schedule, gather your lesson plans, communicate regularly with people that are interested in the garden, promote the garden, have a bulletin board at school. So these are all kinds of ways to sort of maximize the strengths in your community. And then these are the helpful materials that I may have mentioned earlier. Outside of plants and hardscape elements, for using the garden to teach, it's really helpful to have all these tools that really help kids sort of focus and learn in the garden, and also get excited and feel very official about their outdoor classroom space. So things like magnifying glasses, clear jars for collecting samples of all different kinds of things, maybe even cameras, so that kids can focus on, so that they can sort of show you what they're most interested in, what it is that they see and are wondering about. Clipboards for writing, and some just very basic garden tools. Okay, so these are a lot of the resources that I have used. Don't rush to write it all down now. If you're interested, again, I'll be sending this out. Okay, so let's see if we have any questions. I hope everyone could hear. I think I didn't, wasn't checking as we were going. So, so Tanya, you should be unmuted if you want to add anything.
I don't have anything to add now. You really covered it all. I think you did a great job with this presentation. And I also dropped a link in the chat to the evaluation. If anyone has a minute, or I should say it's more of a survey to fill that out. But it does look like there's a question. Do you see the questions, Abby? Do you want to take that?
Let me see if I can see it. In the Q&A.
Yeah, which grade students do you like the most? I'll go ahead and read them off to you.
Oh, okay.
You like working with the most? I guess we should say that's it. Ooh.
What do I like the most? You know, I've actually worked with a few different levels. I love the littles, but I have a son that's 6, so I'm probably biased. There's just a lot of wonderful energy and ways that you can use the garden with really young grades. I'm excited to learn more about middle school school gardens and how to accompany middle schoolers in that space. I haven't worked with middle schoolers very much, so I'd really like to learn more about them. And then I think high school is actually really fun. I've worked with high school students before, and yeah, there's just so much learning and growth that can happen really among any level.
It looks like we have, if you all can, try to put your questions in the Q&A. It's a little easier for me to keep an eye on that. But it looks like Tom asked, what's an ideal number of people in a garden committee as far as teachers and or parents?
I think what we usually recommend is like 10 to 15 for any of our community projects. And again, in a school, having administration, parents, and multiple teachers on board is usually the best way to go. But, you know, some school gardens are very successful with less. Like if you have 2 very committed parent volunteers, those gardens can be very successful. Not all schools are that lucky to have parents with that much free time. So 10 to 15 and a mixture of people.
Yeah, I would also add, you know, it's very individual to your program. So like Abby said, we usually require about 10 to get started. But really ideally, as she mentioned, a mix, not just staff, not just parents, has shown that it's more likely to be sustainable long-term if you have community members involved, some staff members, some parents. You know, and sometimes if it's a school that has the funding to pay, then like she said, sometimes just a couple people can keep that garden program running. But generally that's not the case. So yeah, a good mix. That's always great. Okay, so any more teacher resources, ideas to keep out in the garden? We're getting a potting bench to fill with thingies for the kids to play with. Any ideas help?
So hopefully this answers your question. You can correct me if I'm not getting it, but all those materials that I mentioned at the end, magnifying glasses, binoculars, which can be made out of toilet paper rolls and string, clipboards, kid-friendly cameras, trowels for digging. Lots of those types of things are really helpful materials, and kids get excited to use them, and it makes them feel very official. If that's what you meant by teacher resources. I don't know if you have anything else to add, Tanya. We have a lot on our website in terms of curriculum resources, if you want to check those things out, and lots of other organizations that can support you in building garden-based curriculum.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it's really kind of depends on what your goal is with the garden. You know, we always like to think that like, you don't need many items. Like I would mention a clipboard, something to write with a magnifying glass. Like there are so many possibilities, things that you can do in the garden with just those items. But I would just add also, if you have like a place to keep these things, you might also want to think about putting some items for like volunteers too, not just the students, but like if you're going to have maintenance coming on the weekend or over the summer when they can't access the building or maybe a locked shed, like think about what are the basic things they will need, like whether it's a key to turn on the water, you know, keep a hand trowel, maybe like a laminated list of just basic garden tasks. So you might want to include some things like that too that can help with volunteers coming to work in the garden. It looks like we have another question from Jen. I work on a college community garden. Do you have any suggestions to engage on-campus students to use this resource?
That's an interesting question. I haven't worked with college students in community garden spaces. I think, go ahead, Tanya.
Well, I'm not completely sure what exact, so my first thought is, and we have done like classes, we've done like on-site kind of like field trips with college classes before. And we don't really just limit. I mean, Abby, I have went and talked to groups of students like at SLU that are going through an education program. So we could certainly, you know, come out and present on some of these same concepts to students, if that's kind of what you're asking.
Yeah, and I wonder too, like I feel like it would depend on what students are studying, because there could be, you know, any number of connections to the work that they're hoping to engage in or the things that they're studying and ways that they could use the garden space, both for, you know, academic things and service learning, community projects as well.
Looks like we have another
Funds. I see a question about raising funds for school gardening. You can get creative here. Some schools, kids will grow they'll grow seedlings inside and then have a plant sale later in the spring. It's not always like a guarantee that you're going to have the most amazing plants, because seed starting can be a little bit tricky, even though it's a fun experiment. Some schools raise money from parents, from PTO, or do events in the garden, use the garden as an event space to do little fundraisers. There's lots of school gardening grants. If you are connected with us in our school program newsletter, we often send out grant application ideas for school gardens. Some of those organizations are national organizations that dish out money to school gardens. Tanya, any other ideas for funding?
I think those are all good places to start. I know some schools in our network grow flowers that they sell, kind of have mini school farmers markets. I think you kind of touched on that. Also, I know some schools that have, pretty successful gardens that have even seed saved and then created seed packets, made almost an entire unit out of it and then sold those seeds. But, that does require another kind of level of knowledge when it comes to seed saving. But yeah, there are a lot of resources out there on the internet, I think, with that.
Cool. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Looks like one more came in. This could be our last question. What type of borders fencing would you recommend to keep plants safe and, more importantly, kids safe? So these are high needs students. Types of borders and fencing, I guess, I'm thinking just hardscape here, taller fencing, as opposed to just sometimes you can create borders with just actual plants, but I think maybe if it's a safety need, you would want just a taller fence, really made out of any material that you could access. But it's completely enclosed by the building. There's one garden in our network that their garden area is it's a courtyard in the middle of the building. So I don't know. I don't know if I'm really touching on this question. If it's enclosed by the building, I'm not sure where you would put a fence, or if you would need a fence in that kind of space. So I'm sorry, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but okay. Something to prevent the kids from running through the beds. Okay, I see what you mean. So this, I think, would have a lot to do with the height of the beds, if it's at all possible to make raised beds that are taller or standing on legs. I think that this is probably the best way to do that. You can also use chicken wire around the beds. I don't know how effective that would be in terms of keeping kids out. You could always step over that if you have some higher energy students in the space. So I think mostly that would be just about elevating the beds, or using maybe signs, maybe putting stakes or signs in the beds. Just something to sort of grab their attention before walking through. Stepping stones, identified places maybe with brighter colors, just to kind of be more attention grabbing. And identify places that are safe for walking. So I have to unmute Tanya again. You keep running into
Sorry
this,
about
but
that.
there you are.
I just added in the chat that in my experience, because a lot of times teachers will say, oh, well, how do we keep, like, we have a kindergarten class that plays out there. How are we going to keep them from, like, you know, getting in the beds or pulling things out? And sometimes kids, when they're working in a bed, they will like to step in it. But generally, in my experience, like, once kids get excited about the garden and take some ownership over these plants they planted, like, the last thing they want to do is kill them. So, you know, usually once they have some connection to those plants in that garden, just by having like raised beds, even like the shorter, you know, 8-inch, 12-foot raised beds, and having like clear pathways for them to walk is enough. You know, I rarely see kids that stomp around in the beds or walk through them, you know, intentionally. So.
Okay.
Oh, was there another call? No, I think that's the same one.
Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining. I will send a follow-up email to all the participants to make sure you have access to the links that were throughout my presentation. Feel free to contact us with any further questions or concerns. This is all of our social media, email, etc. Take a look around on our website, lots of resources there. Yep, but we're always open to questions, so get in touch with us if you're curious about anything else. But thank you all and have a good night.